Coming up on this episode of The Folklorist, a man endures an agonizing journey through the untamed wilderness. One woman makes a revolutionary decision to disguise herself and join the fight for liberty. And hear the legendary story of one of the most famed pirates in history. Journey with me now as we explore these fascinating tales on The Folklorist. Welcome to The Folklorist. The Great American Westward Expansion was a time of exploration, opportunity, and adventure. But if you weren't prepared to make the rugged journey across this vast, untamed wilderness, where hostile natives and savage beasts ruled the land, it could become your worst nightmare in an instant. The year is 1823, and the young country was developing a sense of manifest destiny, a belief that American settlers should expand across the continent. But in order to achieve this, they would require safe passage. So General William Ashley, along with Major Andrew Henry, would hire 100 enterprising young men on a journey to ascend the Missouri River with the hope of domesticating the land for future settlers and traders. But anyone venturing out into this uncharted territory would need someone to guide them. A well-seasoned mountain man, somebody who was fierce, strong, and brave. Ashley and Henry found that man when Hugh Glass joined the brigade. Glass was unlike the other men in the expedition, which consisted mostly of young recruits. When sitting around the fire, the young men would whisper to one another, "Who is this man? Where did he come from? How old is he?" Nobody knew the answers, but everyone could sense a still white hell stirring deep within his soul. As the party descended down the river, a hostile tribe of natives ambushed them, forcing General Ashley to order everyone to take cover. But one of the soldiers was left exposed in the line of fire. Without any hesitation, Hugh Glass jumped out, firing his gun as he ran to save the soldier. Ashley ordered the group to return fire, and miraculously, Glass was able to pull the young soldier back to safety. After the attack, Glass realized he had suffered a bullet wound to the hip. Angered, but wanting to make a point to the young man, he said, "My son, brave men are not ashamed to fear, and I've a mind to make a man of you. So here's your first acquaintance with the law." With that, he went off to nurse his wound. From that moment on, he had gained the respect of everyone in the band of explorers. And after his wound healed, he taught them how to track, trap, and kill wild animals. Then, one morning, Hugh Glass would find himself alone while scouting ahead of the party. And it was there, in the quiet woods, where he came upon two bear cubs. As he turned around, a 1,500-pound mother grizzly went on the attack, relentlessly striking, tearing, and shredding the helpless Hugh Glass. Upon hearing his screams, the men quickly rushed to his aid. When they approached Glass, they witnessed something truly horrifying: a severely mauled man, barely alive. Major Henry couldn't risk the whole party staying in this hostile environment, so he ordered John Fitzgerald and Jim Bridger to remain behind with Glass and tend to him through his final days. So Fitzgerald and Bridger waited day after day. Glass was growing increasingly weak, with life fading from him in each passing moment. By week's end, he appeared completely lifeless, so Fitzgerald convinced Bridger that they had to move on and rejoin the company, even though Glass was not yet dead. Fitzgerald knew if they returned to camp without any of Glass's supplies, they would surely be punished, because that would mean he was still alive. So they took his rifle, knife, and boots and left Glass to die. Let's go! Old Hugh Glass should have died that day, but somehow he was able to hold on. Nobody knows how long, but at some point he awoke from his coma He looked around, but where was his gear? He attempted to stand up, but crumpled to the ground. His leg was broken, and he needed to set it. He let out a cry as he set his leg, but thought to himself, was this like Hugh Glass to whimper? And it was at that moment that Glass made a decision. He had to survive in order to take revenge on the men who deserted him. Without any supplies, and despite being extremely weak from blood loss, he began his agonizing journey by dragging himself using only his forearms. His best chance at survival was nearly 200 miles away at a French trading post, Fort Kiowa. In order to survive, he had to feed upon anything that he could find: berries, rattlesnakes, dead animals, day after day after day, driven only by his thirst for revenge. From dragging, he learned to crawl, and 6 weeks in, Glass miraculously pulled himself up, standing for the first time since the attack. But danger still lurked in every direction. One day, Glass was nearly crushed by a stampeding herd of buffalo, and on another, he challenged a pack of wolves for the carcass of a dead animal. But one day, he had a change of fortune. He encountered a Sioux tribesman who offered to clean his wounds. He even helped get Glass closer to his destination by taking him down a river. It had been 3 long months since the encounter with the grizzly, when Glass noticed Fort Kiowa in the distance. Was it a mirage? Somehow, some way, Hugh Glass had survived. By January of 1824, Glass had recovered and was now ready to enact his vengeance upon John Fitzgerald and Jim Bridger. He learned that Major Henry and his men were moving towards the mouth of the Bighorn River. There, Glass was finally able to catch up with his former companions. It was like a ghost appearing in real life. "We all thought you were dead." And that's when Glass turned to find one of the perpetrators, a pale, dumbfounded Jim Bridger. When he confronted him, he couldn't kill the blubbering, apologetic young man. This had been his first expedition, and beneath it all, Glass knew he wasn't to blame. That's when Glass found out that Fitzgerald had joined the army and was at Fort Atkinson in Wisconsin. But if he were to even the score and kill Fitzgerald, the military would have no choice but to hang him. Nevertheless, Glass still traveled to the fort and demanded that the military hand Fitzgerald over to him. They declined, but Glass was able to get his gun back, and people around the camp sympathized with him. And it was at this point that Hugh Glass would end his quest for revenge by forgiving the very men who betrayed him. And because of this act, Jim Bridger would become one of America's greatest mountain men and help keep the legacy of Hugh Glass alive. Is there some folklore in your town? Well, let us know about it. Send us an email, folklorist@newtv.org. We'd love to hear about it. Did you know, as a young man, Hugh Glass was said to have been captured by the notorious pirate Jean Lafitte, who forced him into piracy. He was able to escape by swimming 2 miles to shore, landing in Galveston, Texas. From there, he walked north without a map, weapons, or any supplies before being captured by the Pawnee Indians. It was the spring of 1781, and the American Revolution was raging. Colonists were demanding freedom from the tyranny and oppression of British rule. Many men went off to fight this war, but a woman named Deborah Sampson also believed in this pursuit of liberty and wanted to join the fight. But there was just one problem. Women weren't allowed to enlist in the army. She knew what she had to do: conceal her true identity by dressing as a man. She was well aware the highest punishment for doing so was death, but this did not deter her resolve. While donning men's attire and assuming the identity of her late brother Robert Shirtliff Sampson, she successfully enlisted in the 4th Massachusetts Regiment of the Continental Army. Initially, the other soldiers poked fun at her. "Well, you're a little lad, aren't you? Why, have you no facial hair? Sir, do you know how to handle your musket? But her ruse proved to be a success, and the other soldiers didn't suspect a thing. Deborah's first mission was to provide General George Washington with vital intelligence by spying on the British in Manhattan. It was here that she experienced her first taste of conflict when her group was attacked by British troops. No pen can describe my feelings experienced in the commencement of an engagement, the sole object of which is to open the sluices of human blood. In September of 1781, her company arrived in Yorktown and engaged in the final battle against the British. Deborah dug trenches as cannonballs soared overhead. She formed up with her company and returned fire before storming the British defenses. British General Cornwallis eventually surrendered, signaling a major victory for the Americans. But seeing her fallen comrades on the battlefield was deeply disturbing. But the revolution was not over, and these events only strengthened Deborah's determination to continue the fight for independence. June 1782. Deborah's company was on patrol outside of Tarrytown, New York, when suddenly they were ambushed by a band of British Tories. They engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat, and during the melee, Deborah received a severe gash on her forehead. The regiment was able to push them back, but she soon discovered she had been shot twice in the thigh. Dread swept across her face. She knew if surgeons operated on her leg, they would surely discover that she was a woman. But her comrades wouldn't hear of it and refused to abandon her. They rode several miles to a hospital where a doctor treated the laceration on her forehead. But before he could treat her gunshot wounds, she fled. Once alone, she removed the musket balls herself, but needed time to recover. She received permission to nurse another injured soldier, Richard Snow, at the remote farmhouse of Abraham Van Tassel. In exchange for payment from the Americans, Van Tassel offered them food and lodging. But they soon found themselves confined to a hot and stuffy attic, where they were treated more like prisoners than patients. When she asked for straw for Snow to sleep on, Van Tassel exclaimed, "The floor and fastings are good enough for rebels." And later that night, Deborah could hear the clamor of men carousing beneath the floorboards. She suspected them to be part of the notorious gang of British loyalists known as the Cowboys, and Van Tassel himself to be a Tory. She knew that they were not safe at the house and that they had to leave as soon as they recovered. Thankfully, Van Tassel's daughter was sympathetic to the American cause and brought the soldiers food and water whenever she could. But Snow's illness began to worsen, and on the 10th night of their stay, he passed away. So with the help of two men, Deborah buried her friend and fled to rejoin her regiment. Deborah informed her superiors that British loyalists were frequent visitors of the farmhouse and sought to expose Van Tassel and avenge the death of her fellow soldier. With the help of Van Tassel's daughter, Deborah devised a plan to return to the farmhouse with her troops and capture the Tories. They waited until midnight while the gang inside indulged in copious amounts of alcohol, as Van Tassel's daughter disarmed the Cowboys. Now it was time to strike. They fired their muskets into the air in a loud and raucous barrage. The Tories stumbled out of the house. The drunk gang was stunned as they were surrounded by American soldiers who demanded their immediate surrender. Deborah released Van Tassel in exchange for food and horses for the troops. Her mission was a success, and she was especially proud that no blood had been shed. Over the next several months, Deborah continued her amazing ruse, fighting as a male soldier in the Continental Army. In February of 1783, she was appointed as an aide to General John Patterson, who sent her to Philadelphia to quell an uprising. But soon after she arrived, she caught a severe fever, lost consciousness, and was taken to a nearby hospital. This time, however, she couldn't conceal the secret she'd been hiding all along. She was examined by Dr. Benjamin Binney, but it didn't take long for Binney to discover that the soldier lying unconscious was actually a woman. Binney waited until Deborah had recovered before informing General Patterson of his shocking discovery. Patterson, in turn, contacted General Washington. But instead of being hanged for her act of deception, Deborah was granted an honorable discharge. Deborah's time as a soldier had come to an end, but for the rest of her life, people would remember her valiant tour of duty. She gave lectures around the country, dressed in her male uniform, and gained the respect of countless people. Despite the notoriety, she struggled to make ends meet and became the first woman to request a monthly pension from the U.S. government. Paul Revere was made aware of her plight, and in 1804 he wrote a letter to Congress. I have no doubt your humanity will prompt you to do all in your power to get her some relief. I think her case much more deserving than hundreds to whom Congress have been generous. This was the extra push she needed, and she was awarded a $4 monthly pension the following year. Her story of courage and perseverance would go on to inspire countless women across the country who one by one would break down the walls of gender inequality. And so Deborah Sampson's revolutionary act of standing up and fighting for a cause that she believed in would secure her place in history, which is why she is remembered as the American heroine. There's more to come on The Folklorist. Did you know Margaret Corbin also fought in the Revolutionary War, but dressed as a woman? While defending Fort Washington in 1776 against attacking Hessians, her husband John was wounded while manning a cannon. Margaret took his place and continued firing until she was wounded. Because of her heroism, she was also awarded a pension for her military service. Disclaimer: with folklore, sometimes the biggest casualty is fact. But please, keep watching. After the golden age of piracy had ended, there was one man who terrorized ships in the waters off the Gulf Coast, instilling fear into the hearts of men when they saw the black flag raised and heard the name Gasparilla. Jose Gaspar lived a privileged life. He was born into a wealthy Spanish family in the year 1756, but during his youth, he would find himself drawn to criminal behavior, even kidnapping a young girl and holding her for ransom. However, after he was caught, the authorities gave him an ultimatum: either join the Spanish Royal Navy or go straight to prison. And thus began his life of storied adventures on the high seas. The Navy assigned him to a ship called the Florida Blanca, and by the age of 27, Gaspar had risen through the ranks after his commanders observed his great skills in tactics and weaponry. Gaspar was named the naval representative in the court of King Charles III of Spain, and soon gained the reputation as a romancer, charming many women along the way, including the daughter-in-law of the king, Maria Luisa. But Gaspar, much like Maria Luisa, was an unfaithful lover and continued to pursue other women during their courtship. And when Maria Luisa confronted him in a jealous rage, he confirmed her suspicions. He then showed no remorse for his actions and left the princess broken-hearted. But hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, so Maria Luisa devised a plan for revenge. She formed an alliance with the prime minister and arranged to have the Spanish crown jewels stolen with the intent of framing Gaspar. The plan was now in motion, and rumors spread around court with Maria Luisa accusing Gaspar of the crime. He needed to act quickly, knowing that despite his innocence, it was the crown's word against his. If he were caught, he would surely be hung for treason. So with no other options, Gaspar and a band of escaped prisoners stormed the Florida Blanca and commandeered the ship. He instated himself as captain and changed his name to Gasparilla. He set sail for the Florida coast, never to return to his homeland, vowing to pillage and plunder any ship that flew the Spanish flag. He became the scourge of the seven seas, along with his gang of cutthroat killers, terrorizing merchant ships in the Caribbean, demanding that captured crews either join the ranks or walk the plank. During one of their raids, he encountered an old friend from the Spanish Navy, Captain Menendez. But instead of forcing him to suffer the same fate the others had, he spared his life and treated him like a friend and confidant. Then, one night, a mutinous crew member snuck up behind Gasparilla. Menendez saw this and tackled the assailant, but during the struggle, both men suffered mortal wounds. And so Menendez had bravely given his own life for Gasparilla's. He was forever grateful for the sacrifice that his friend made, and he continued to stock vessels across the sea. And during one of those raids, he captured an English ship, and on board was a beautiful young woman named Anne Jeffrey, who caught Gasparilla's attention. It didn't take long for the captain to fall madly in love with her, asking for her hand in marriage, but it wasn't meant to be. On the day he proposed to her, she rejected him, confessing her love for one of Gasparilla's youngest men, Battista. The captain was heartbroken, but surprisingly, out of his love for her, he spared them from a watery death and even provided them with safe passage back to England. Gasparilla was never the same, and as the years passed, he reflected back on his life and was now ready to retire. After all, he had amassed a great fortune and no longer held a vendetta against Spain. But then, on the horizon, he spotted a British ship and couldn't resist one last plunder. They moved within range, and just as they were about to strike, the Union Jack was lowered, and what rose struck fear among the crew. This was no British merchant ship. It was the USS Enterprise, an American pirate hunting schooner. A bloody broadside ensued. It was now a matter of life or death. Cannonballs ripped through the hull of Gasparilla's ship. The masts and the sails were on fire. The crew was suffering heavy casualties. This was Gasparilla's final stand. The Enterprise prepared to board the ship. And there, at the bow, behind a veil of smoke, was Gasparilla chained to an anchor. He then threw it into the sea and proclaimed, "Gasparilla dies by his own hand, not the enemy's." His body plunged into the dark abyss. His reign over the high seas had come to an end. The legend of Gasparilla was passed down by Juan Gomez, who claimed to be a crew member aboard the ship during its final battle. And to this day, the city of Tampa, Florida, holds an annual festival in his honor, making Gasparilla one of the most celebrated folklore figures in history. Did you know during his exploits on the high seas, it is said that Gasparilla amassed a great fortune? Legend has it that his treasure is buried on Gasparilla Island, which is situated off the southwest coast of Florida. Many treasure hunters have attempted to find it without success. The unbelievable story of a frontiersman whose quest for revenge turns into a tale of forgiveness. One woman's fight for freedom solidifies her place in history as the American heroine, and the rise and fall of a man forced to live the life of piracy. These are the stories that are passed on through the generations. We are the Folklorists, and this is the new history. Till next time.